what happens when the seller's payment to the buyer's broker is less than what's listed on the representation agreement? I'll explain the implications and how to fix this. So here we're looking at a buyer representation agreement, a BRBC form, and we have 2.5% as an example. Let's say you put 2.5% of the sales price. That's the buyer's obligation to their agent for commission. But let's say you're drafting an offer. Here we have a purchase agreement, and you find out the most the seller's willing to pay is 2%. So you go down here on page 2 and you check this box and put in 2%. Now, typically you would put in the entire amount on the representation agreement, 2.5%. And then you find out later when the listing agent sends you a counter, and that counter reduces your commission. So typically you see the reduction on a counter offer. But just for an example, I'm showing you that let's say it's only 2%. Let's say you found out in advance somehow. Okay, so this creates a shortage because the seller's only paying 2%, but you're charging 2.5%. Now, in a perfect world, the buyer who's still on the hook for that 0.5%, that discrepancy, they're going to pay it. The buyer pays the 0.5%, the seller pays 2%, and you're made whole through escrow because escrow is going to bill each side to make you whole. But that's not always the case. Often, an agent will want to do a reduction to relieve the buyer of their remaining obligation. Now, in theory, if the buyer's agent's collecting the 2% from the seller and they're happy with that, in theory, that transaction could close. The buyer's agent gets the 2%, they're happy, and they never go after the buyer for the remaining 0.5%. But that's problematic because you have this obligation just floating out there. I mean, the buyer's still on the hook. This is a contract, and the buyer's still on the hook for the difference. So even if you as a buyer's agent say, don't worry, we're just going to ignore the 0.5% you owe me, I'm fine with whatever the seller's paying, that's a problem because your broker could step in and your broker could go after the buyer for the 0.5%. Your broker could pursue the buyer legally. And even though that you and the buyer might have some verbal arrangement. So what you do not want to do is just leave this open. So how do you fix this? Well, it's real simple. You use this form, modification of terms, specifically the buyer representation agreement, because there's another modification of terms to modify the listing agreement. So we have the MT-BR to show that this pertains to the buyer representation agreement. And the fix is very simple. By default, this form addresses the BRBC, and you put the date of your representation agreement here, the name of your brokerage, the name of your buyer, and right down here, you just write in the change of compensation. In this case, we're saying from 2.5% to 2% of the sales price. And it's important you check this box and you write that it's on the property in which you're in escrow. Why? Well, what happens if you do this form and you don't check this box and write in that property? It means that you've now limited yourself on any other property that you're going to show this buyer if this falls out of escrow. So you don't want this to be a blanket reduction. You want it to just match the terms specifically on this one property. And should this property fall out of escrow, you should revert back to your 2.5%, which you may very well get on another purchase, on another transaction. So that's why you want to be specific to this one transaction. Now, the other thing that agents are tempted to do, which is very bad, is to try to do something here on the BRBC, on the representation agreement, that relieves the buyer the obligation, like make a deal, like put a lower number or some convoluted schedule of that lets the buyer off the hook if the seller won't pay. You cannot do that. Not only is that against the rules for realtors, it's now illegal in California. There's a law, AB 2992, and that went into effect January 1st. And so you must have the greatest number possible here on the BRBC because that's the most you can ask for when you ask for commission. You need to explain this to the buyer, and you need to tell the buyer that you're going to ask for the seller to pay toward your commission, and that's going to relieve the buyer's obligation to the extent the seller is willing to pay. And should the seller not pay, then you can make a verbal commitment to the buyer that you can address it in escrow, during escrow, after you have an accepted offer. Keyword, after you have an accepted offer, to reduce the commission in order to relieve the buyer from any remaining obligation. But this must happen in that order, because if you do not do it in the order that I'm advising here, it's very likely unlawful and problematic. You cannot entertain some buyer that's bullying you into putting some low commission here. You as an agent must be able to present all of this that I'm showing you here and articulate it in a manner that the buyer's going to understand that you legally cannot make some sort of commitment in writing that you promise to reduce this commission should the seller not pay the full amount. You cannot do that. They need to understand that they're on the hook for this amount no matter what, and it's up to you after an offer is accepted and the seller has made the commitment of paying a certain commission amount, only then are you permitted to make that reduction. That's it. That's how it's done. And it must be done in that order to be lawful. That's just how it works now that this law is in effect, that went into effect January 1st, AB 2992. Okay, hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you.